I'm someone who's spent pretty much their whole life living in cities. Both big cities and smaller suburban ones, but always the kind of paved-over houses and corporations and big blocky parking structures kinds of places. I'm lucky in that pretty much everywhere I've lived has a good amount of green space, but most of that was the trees lining the roads, public parks, people's gardens, and otherwise human-curated areas. So I don't see much wildlife unless I make a specific effort to do so. Maybe that's why I like zoos and nature preserves so much. They're specifically designed to give people a good chance at seeing animals, and that's great if you're like me and you never see wildlife on a day-to-day basis. Except, that's not true at all. I mean, most of it is. I have always lived in cities, and those are the main reasons I like zoos and preserves. But the idea that we don't see wildlife if we live in urban areas is fundamentally untrue. Squirrels are wildlife. Crows and songbirds are wildlife. Insects are wildlife, and so are rats and mice, and sometimes dogs and cats. Wildlife is defined as organisms that live wild in an area, and colloquially, we're most often talking about animals. Urban wildlife is, fittingly, when that area is a human settlement, particularly cities, suburbs, and towns. Urban wildlife are animals that have adapted to living in human-centric environments, often depending on or at least taking advantage of human behavior and the resources we provide. Further breaking it down, we have native animals, non-native animals, and feral animals. Native animals are the species that are naturally found in the area. This is going to greatly vary depending on where in particular you are looking. Here in Denver, I see a lot of cottontail rabbits and black-billed magpies. Non-native species are those that arrive to an area they would not naturally be found, by way of human activity. This is not necessarily synonymous with invasive species, though straightforward, beneficial non-native species seem to be more limited to plants. With animals, it's often a matter of perspective, leaving some species in a gray area between simply non-native and invasive. The Rocky Mountain goat, although something of a mascot of Mount Evans, was only introduced to Colorado in 1947. Due to its apparent lack of harm to the ecosystem, not outcompeting its native counterpart, the bighorn sheep, and general positive attitude toward the species, they are not considered invasive and were even legally declared native in 1993. Nonetheless, if their population continues to grow, some biologists predict that they may eventually have a negative effect on the native sheep population through food competition or spread of disease. Honeybees were introduced to the Americas from Europe, and they have been a major boon to agriculture and many native plant species due to their effectiveness as pollinators. However, in many areas they can crowd out the hundreds of native species of bee, which are generally solitary and don't have the offensive numbers of honeybee hives. Ecosystems can also adapt over time to invasive species. The island apple snail is a large, ravenous mollusk that is invasive to the Florida Everglades, home of an endangered population of snail kites. However, the birds adapted, growing larger and increasing their beak size to eat the invaders, and combined with habitat restoration and other conservation efforts, the local population has thrived and increased with its new, plentiful food source. Bizarre Beasts has a great video that goes into more detail on the kites and snails, which I've linked in the description. Finally, there are feral animal populations. Feral species are fully domesticated, but living without human care. Rock doves, aka those funny little guys you see in almost every major city, are feral. Pigeons were raised as food, both eggs and meat, as well as for sports such as racing and acrobatics, as pets, and as messengers. And then we almost universally decided we didn't want to look after them anymore. The domestic pigeons, left on their own, reproduced and formed big flocks, still thriving in human-centric habitats, scavenging for food and becoming a food source for other animals, particularly feral cat colonies and feral dog packs, perpetuating the feral populations of many species at once. Urban wildlife is unavoidable. Whenever we develop land for human use, we are encroaching on the habitat of existing wildlife. Then, once it's established, we get species coming in to take advantage of the changes we made. An interesting case here in Denver is Canada geese. They are supposed to be here, part of the time. They're migratory. The geese are supposed to be here for the colder months, then fly back north once spring comes around. But a large population is here all year. They like the non-native monoculture Kentucky bluegrass lawns we have in pretty much all of our parks, a delicious and nutritious food source for them, as well as the french fries and popcorn stolen from the hands of small children at the zoo. And while we all think goslings are cute, they are not supposed to be here. They crowd out and compete with native bird species like egrets and cormorants, effectively an invasive species simply because they don't want to leave. Negative interactions between the geese and humans are common, from geese hissing and biting to the inevitable bowel problems they get from eating that stolen popcorn. So, how do you have responsible interactions with urban wildlife? There are a lot of ways. First, stand your ground against the goose. He can't really hurt you. Both you and he will be better off if you keep your food to yourself. Really, the main thing about urban wildlife is you do not want them to acclimate to humans. Let them live their lives while you live yours. Don't feed wild animals. You don't know what is good for them, and if they come to depend on humans for food, they can become aggressive when they don't get it, or simply not be able to find food themselves later on. Also, if you have outdoor trash or compost, make sure it's secure enough that animals can't get in to feast. Animals who have become too acclimated to humans run a much higher risk of being hurt or killed themselves. Large predators like bears and mountain lions can get themselves into a lot of trouble wandering the streets of cities. Many problem animals, like tundra at Denver Zoo, are sent to zoos because they learn to raid campsites, dumpsters, and even cars to find food. Even more aren't lucky enough to be relocated, instead being euthanized or killed in self-defense. Simple things like picking up litter can also be a big help to wildlife, especially in parks and other areas animals tend to gather. With feral animals, like cat colonies, see if there's a rescue and/or trap-neuter release program near you and offer your help. While many adult ferals may not ever become gentle house pets, having them spayed and neutered will prevent more litters, and vaccination can control the spread of disease. Some places even offer barn cat services, relocating not-quite-pet material cats to indoor areas where they can serve as pest control. In return, they get food and shelter while being removed from the ecosystems that they endanger. And regarding pest control, it's best to avoid the use of poisons. While rodents like rats and mice are urban wildlife, their populations can easily become out of control and dangerous to public health, and most infestations consist of non-native species introduced by Europeans. But poison doesn't stay limited to a specific target. Whatever predator or scavenger eats the rat also eats the poison, making it ill or killing it as well, and this can travel all the way up the food chain to large predators like mountain lions. There are plenty of humane traps and methods of pest control, both lethal and non-lethal, that do not have this kind of lasting effect on the ecosystem. But there are lots of ways to safely interact with wildlife. Arguably, the best way, if you're able, is to have native plants. Native plants attract native animals. They're built to work together. Native grasses and flowers make great gardens and provide food and shelter to many species, particularly bees, butterflies, and birds, and are shown to increase biodiversity in urban landscapes. Having native plants in your garden can also be a more effective and safe alternative to bird feeders. The effects of bird feeding vary by species, location, and other variables, but can often lead to certain species, often invasive ones, crowding out the others, and for more potential for the spread of disease, either through viruses like avian influenza, or bacteria due to not properly cleaning the feeder. Having native plants still attracts birds to your garden, and the native plants may be spread through the seeds present in the birds' droppings. Our popcorn-stealing goose friend from earlier loves the non-native Kentucky bluegrass, but the native buffalo grass is a lot less appealing. Replacing lawn areas with this alternative is a possible way to encourage the Canada goose to migrate. Providing shelters for wildlife is also a great way to engage. Birdhouses can be customized to encourage specific species, that is, native ones, to move in and nest, both helping the birds survive and giving yourself opportunities to see them. Bat boxes and bee houses are also great ways to help wildlife and are getting more accessible and available to buy or make. I particularly like these because they are a great way to improve the average person's understanding of and appreciation for scary animals. While most bat houses aren't going to be used by particularly threatened species, the ones who do enjoy them can be a representative for their fellows, showing just how cute and interesting bats can be. Bee houses do the same, and provide potential habitats for solitary bee species which, if you may recall, are native to North America, unlike the hive-dwelling honeybees. Bee houses provide habitat for the native species, are educational for the people housing them, and you can easily find kits or instructions on how to make them yourself. Solitary bees are also a lot less likely to sting, not having a large community or honey stores to protect. So, to sum up, wildlife is all around you. Interact responsibly by observing from a distance, not letting yourself or pets come into direct contact. Be aware of how animals interact with you and your environment. Don't leave human food or trash out for them, don't use dangerous poisons, and support native species. As usual, I've left both sources and resources for the things I've talked about in the description.